So you said you are a veteran of the Iraq War
Yes, and Afghanistan.
and Afghanistan. You were in service for how long?
I joined the Army in 2004, and I got out in 2010. I did roughly 5.5 months of, quote, service.
5.5 years, you mean?
5.5 years.
Okay, yeah.
So 5.5 years. I was in Iraq for 15 months in 2006 and 2007. Then I was in Afghanistan in 2009 for 12 months. So roughly 2 years in a combat zone. And that was my first major political lesson, because I went to Iraq under President George Bush for the Republican Party. And then I went to Afghanistan under Obama, the Democratic Party. And they both did the same policies which failed in both wars. And we know that decades later. When I was in Iraq, Bush announced the surge. People aren't familiar with the surge. It was, Iraq was in a civil war, the US was losing the war, so they were like, we just need to surge the country. More weapons, more troops, more money for bribes. It failed. A few years later, Obama gets into office, he's deciding what to do with Afghanistan, and he decides to do the Afghanistan surge. So this was my real political lesson, that both major political parties in the US have the same policies on major issues, especially foreign policy, that ultimately aren't in the interests of the Iraqi people or the working class people of the United States. They are a small, tiny minority that represent their own interests. And, you know, I had friends who died over there. It was really rough. It was really bad. I was in a paratrooper unit. I was in an airborne unit, meaning I was a paratrooper. I got to jump out of airplanes, which was really cool. But I was also a mechanic. So I got to see firsthand all of the vehicles that were blown up, and we had to work on many vehicles that were covered in blood. And we were also rocketed and mortared on our bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of traumatic events. Went through a really rough, tough time. For what? You know, a decade and a half later, 2 decades later, you know, I questioned what I was doing. And it was really part of my own ignorance joining the US military, of not really knowing what I was getting myself into. I thought I was serving my country. I ended up learning that I was actually serving the capitalist imperialist class of the US.
So where do you grow up? What's the background made you want to join the Army?
I was born in a military family. Both my parents were in the US Army. My father did 22 years, was a retiree, a lifer. My mother, who's from South Korea, actually met my father when he was stationed in South Korea. She ended up joining the US Army, becoming a US citizen. I was born in West Germany.
Wow.
Before Germany was united again.
Right.
And shortly after, I lived in South Korea, which, you know, the first 8 years of my lives was living in a heavily militarized country that was split by a lot of the bourgeois policies that was going on around the world. Then I came to the US when I was about 8 years old, moved around from military base to military base. Ended up in southeast rural Georgia, in a town of 2,000 people. No opportunity ahead of me as I graduated high school. And so I decided, and also when I graduated, the Iraq War was kicking off. The Afghanistan War was already going on. And I hurt myself on the job doing some roofing work, working on roofs, construction jobs. And I was like, if I'm working this hard, I might as well join the Army and get some benefits. Get some health care at least. And that's what I did. And I also was raised by my parents with a sense of like serving your country if you're able to, right? So I thought there was somewhat of like a noble cause of joining the military at the time.
So they were proud of the US Army.
Very proud of the US Army, very pro-America, nothing else.
But your dad, where does he come from? Which part?
He was also born in West Germany on a US military base.
Whoa!
Yeah. Yes.
Wow, that's a long generation of military service.
Yes. To this day, he still has a green card, even though he is like a white American. He was a white man who was born in West Germany but raised in the U.S.
He has a green card for Germany.
Yes. I was also born a West German citizen at the time.
Oh. A lot of people follow the military, go around, but that really make them destabilize in their childhood. Just like you making new friends all the time.
Yeah, I can talk about that.
Yeah.
So I was the only child.
Okay.
And we moved around. You know, by the age of 8, I was on 3 continents.
Right.
And as I got older, every move was more difficult. And I always wondered to this day, what is it like to have a hometown?
Right.
What is it like to have like a home community?
Right.
Which I believe most of the world knows what that's like.
Right, I know.
And it's pretty integral to being a human being,
right,
as we're social creatures. And that was kind of taken away from me. And I do realize that now. But I will say, through the lessons that I have learned, and despite how the U.S. military has shaped my life, there's a artist that has a lyric that I particularly like that I think fits my life. It says that I'm a product of the system that I was born to destroy. So after the military, I got out. I joined the peace and anti-war movement, and I got into more radical and revolutionary politics, and have been organizing ever since.
Like, what made you join the peace movement?
So, like I said, the first political lesson of my life was Iraq and Afghanistan, and learning that both major political parties are on the same side, opposite of the working class here. And so I wanted to learn about the U.S. military, because one of the realizations I had getting out after 5.5 years in the Army, also my whole life living on military bases, I came to the realization that I actually didn't know much about the U.S. military and the whole system. So I actually used my GI Bill and went to college to study political science.
Where did you go?
I went to a college in San Diego, California.
Okay.
And the information that I was learning, both at college, but also going home, I had a lot more free time to go home on the internet,
right,
ask all these questions. What's going on in the world? Why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
And time after time, event after event, I was learning about all the horrible things that the U.S. Ruling class has done throughout the world, within the U.S. And for me at that time, I was like, why is nobody talking about this? Like, you can go out in society in the U.S. and nobody really is talking about this stuff.
Well, in the U.S., but outside.
In the U.S., and I've learned that through my experience in the peace and anti-war movement, where I've traveled to over a dozen countries with the movement. Mm-hmm. But so I really became vocal. I ended up found a veterans organization called Veterans for Peace. Mm-hmm. I also found Iraq Veterans Against the War, which mm-hmm. later turned into a new name called About Face, Veterans mm-hmm. Against the War. I got involved with every peace and anti-war organization that I could, and I have been involved with the movement for 10 years now. Mm-hmm. I've gotten to travel to South Korea many times with all the U.S. military bases there, to Okinawa mm-hmm. 5 times at least. I've been to Palestine, mm-hmm. all over Western Europe, India, Nepal, mm-hmm. All over the U.S., visiting places like Standing Rock, where a lot of veterans congregated there in support of the indigenous people. Mm-hmm. And so all of these lessons, like you said, taught me, one, that people outside of the U.S. are talking about what the U.S. military is doing and the U.S. government is doing. Yeah. But also, two, that people are also very forgiving and understanding that I was a young man who joined this thing, the U.S. Army, not knowing what it is. Mm-hmm. And as long as I came to the realization that I was on the wrong side of history, they were completely open and forgiving and open to having conversations. I'll tell you one short story that represents this in Palestine. There was this activist, and he didn't know the translation of Veterans for Peace, meaning like former military members, now peace activists. Mm-hmm. And he helped make dinner for all of us. We had a veteran delegation there. And he found out that we were like veterans of Iraq. And he came up to me specifically and basically started to yell at me and curse at me. And he basically said, I can never forgive you for what you've done in Iraq. And I just broke down, like crying. But another older Palestinian activist talked to him for a few minutes. And then a few more minutes passed. That same young Palestinian man, he goes up, he fixes a plate of food for me, and he gives it to me. And we have dinner together, which was one of the most beautiful moments I had, while also dealing with a lot of the guilt of me participating in destroying entire countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, and being so ignorant about it. But I made a promise to myself that I would never be so ignorant about joining any type of organization moving on for the rest of my life.
Right.
So after several years in the peace and anti-war movement, where I became on the board of directors of several organizations and traveling overseas, I had a whole wide experience, all kinds of experiences. But I realized nothing was actually being done. Nothing was being accomplished. There's no real like successes to what we were doing, despite the tons of money and time of talking about doing these things. And so I realized the peace and anti-war movement is essentially a petty bourgeois movement that is completely disconnected from the masses, the working class specifically in the US. And I didn't know that at the time, but it led me to start looking into Marxism, more radical politics.
What triggered that?
Well, my timeline was after the US military, I became a techno-utopian. It's like, all this technology exists. Right. We can feed the whole planet. Why don't we do that? Right. Then I was like, oh, we need to overthrow the state. So I got into anarchist politics. And then I had a lot of questions about anarchism and learning its history and its so-called theory. And then I was like, well, I actually don't know anything about socialism. So let me start looking into that. Right. And then I really started to get into Marxism these past 6 years. And it has really just opened up a whole new world for me to have like an actual concrete understanding of the concrete situations that are going on around the world. I've never found so much clarity. And even it helps me understand my time as a techno-utopian activist, but also an activist and organizer in the peace and anti-war movement. And really, this fundamental contradiction in society is between the bourgeoisie and the working class, the proletariat. But there's also this class that vacillates between the two, the petty bourgeois class. And that is mainly what the peace and anti-war movement has been made up of, and that's where their interests lie. So even though they may criticize U.S. foreign policy publicly, openly, and sometimes quite correctly, they will also be against and reject the interests of the working class at the same time.
In what specific?
So the peace and anti-war movement is heavily impacted by pacifism.
Right.
They think the opposite of war is complete pacifism. Right. But pacifism is actually not in the interest of the working class. Because we know that the working class is enslaved by capital. Their labor is enslaved by capital, and they need to forcefully break these chains to do so. Which means they cannot have a pacifist view on all things. I think the working class definitely wants to be as peaceful as possible, but if it's a necessity to overthrow the bourgeoisie here with revolutionary violence, that is in the interest of the working class, and the petty bourgeois class will often, especially in the peace and anti-war movement, reject those ideas because it is not in their interest. So that goes into petty bourgeois moralism compared to working class moralism. It makes really like a child would know this. But somehow the petty bourgeoisie will wrap their interests into this and provide all these examples in history and say, oh no, actually nonviolence really works. I like what Kwame Ture actually says when he's criticizing Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is a great inspiration of this country. He taught, especially Black Americans, to stand up against their oppressor. Be fearless in that, right? But I think his strategy of organizing was incorrect. And Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, actually says it pretty well. He says that Martin Luther King Jr. took nonviolence, which is a tactic, and he turned it into a principle.
Right.
And I think that's totally incorrect, but also very spot on for the current peace and anti-war movement today in the U.S.
Right. They made it a principle. That's a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you got into socialism, and then what else? What happened next?
Well, I think anybody who knows anything about Marxism knows that it takes many years to develop an understanding, a basic understanding of Marxism. After all, it is a science. It's a science of our social reality. So I think I did what many American Marxists do, is they quickly learn something and they feel like they become an expert at it immediately. There's actually a study called the Dunning-Kruger effect. You could study something for 1 year,
Right.
and then immediately you're like, oh, I know everything there is to know about this topic. And you start teaching other people and start talking confidently, maybe even arrogantly about all this stuff. But then it's kind of funny. The more you learn, the more you understand how much you don't know.
Right. That's true.
And I've been very humbled through that process in the past 6 years. And I do think I've taken study pretty seriously. I've experimented with a couple of things here and there. I've learned mainly through mistakes, which I think we know is almost like a universal principle, right? Make as many mistakes as possible and learn from those mistakes. And yeah, it's been humbling, but it also has given me a more concrete understanding of the world and what we need to do, while also understanding that there's a lot of experimentation that we need to work with today in the U.S.
So, do you feel free to share some of these mistakes?
Yes. So the U.S. Maoist movement has made a huge fundamental mistake that I think is actually anti-Marxist to its core. And that is making a moralistic appeal to a class analysis rather than a scientific investigation of a class analysis. So what I mean by that is the world knows that racism in the US is very dominant. It's everywhere in our culture and the economic system, but political system. So what happens with this moralistic appeal is that we know that, say, Black Americans, even indigenous people here, Native Americans, are some of the most oppressed races of people that we know. And so a moralistic appeal will say, oh, these people are the leaders, the vanguard of the revolution. This is the actual proletariat. When a scientific investigation of the class analysis requires understanding the relationship to the means of production, relationship to labor, all kinds of other things that aren't just based on just race. And so the U.S. Maoist movement has and it's not even the U.S. Maoist movement, but the communist movement in the U.S. for decades have abandoned the working class and gone into the hoods, the favelas, the barrios, places outside of the workplace, where the workplace is kind of where the fundamental contradiction of capital and labor exists. But then we've left that, and the U.S. Maoist movement has really taken up a lot of those ideas from people like Jay Sakai and other organizations that are more dominant, like PSL. There's all kinds of tendencies of Marxism here, and there's been absolutely no success in building anything very concrete through that method, and that took me years to really understand. Where really in just the past maybe 2 years, questioning that. And then finally coming to the conclusion, it's like, well, what is a scientific investigation of this class analysis of society, of the fundamental contradiction? And how do we apply the lessons of Marxism to that? Which is, we got to go into the workplace. We got to link up and fuse with the working class while also developing this communist movement and just fuse it with the working class. But it's also learning this lesson of, maybe 60, 70 years of the failure of communists who have abandoned the workplace. We need to go back to the workplace and start from there. That doesn't mean the hoods and all types of other oppression aren't important. It's just as important. But when we have this fundamental area of organizing, say in labor unions,
Right.
the unorganized within the working class movement, and that's going to be the key, the foundation of the revolutionary movement in the US. So we are trying to start to get back into that and bring Marxism back, so to speak.
It's tough. It's tough. I've been there, 80s and 90s. A lot of people went to, after the anti-war movement, they went to the working class, but not showing much success. I mean, you got some. So I think the people find that it's easier to show some success in neighborhood organizing or in other social programs. You can have demonstrations. And of course, you're right. I mean, after you demonstrate, what else? What's next? Okay? What to show for it, right? And so it's tough. And especially when the collapse of the Soviet Union and the history and the left would just really just feel totally lost. And I'm part of that. Took a long time to climb back in, go out of that ditch, or actually cannon, just really deep.
And another point that I've learned over the years is how important the differences between correct ideas and incorrect ideas are to organizing, specifically communist organizing. But the so-called left in the US today is very confused, and it even impacts the peace and anti-war movement. I think a good example is About Face, the organization called About Face Veterans Against the War. It used to be Iraq Veterans Against the War. So what happened is the peak of and it's a veterans organization, right? And we need veterans who are deployed all around the world. We need them in the peace and anti-war movement and in the working class movement. But what happened is, like, at the peak of this organization, probably from 2008 to 2012, one of the questions I asked is, like, why was it so big at this time? Well, it's because that organization accepted Marxists, anarchists, progressives, Republicans, conservatives, libertarians. And they were like, if you're against the war, join this organization. They made national headline news doing the stuff that they did back then. But then since 2012, it has, like, slowly, gradually, sometimes very fast, dwindled down to a very small organization. So what has happened is these pseudo-leftists, these fake leftists, and these confused ideas that are mainly petty bourgeois ideas has come into the organization, like postmodern identity politics, where in a veteran organization, they will say, well, you're a white man, you need to sit down, let this black woman or Puerto Rican woman speak up. And there's a whole wide range of problems that can come with that type of attitude, right? And so it didn't even become about opposing these, wars and deployments and interventions overseas. It became more about, like, yelling at each other and this infighting because of how you look and not what you thought, the good ideas that you may have. On top of that, when I ask someone, what demographic, what kind of a person do you think of when you think of a U.S. military veteran? It's a white man. It's mostly white men who are in the military, and most U.S. veterans are are white men. And so you're shutting down the conversation for all of these people who are first trying to get into this organization, trying to learn how to organize and become an activist, and you're shutting them out. So what happens? All these people, they leave and they go to a different tendency. And this is why right now veterans are mostly in libertarian organizations. Libertarianism in the US is basically free market capitalism. It's the government that's bad. Big government is really bad, etc. It's a really backwards idea.
Well, it's like Trumpers.
It is. And it goes into supporting people like Trump. But this is the problem with specifically the veteran section of the peace and anti-war movement, where these petty bourgeois ideas keep coming in, and they haven't grown, they've dwindled, and it's kind of pathetic at this point of what they're doing. I'm really sad. I would like to see a strong veteran movement in the peace and anti-war movement, but also in getting involved with working class politics, because I think people don't know this, but about 9% of the U.S. population are made up of veterans. And we have a lot of experiences inside the military, the armed forces, inside of the government, how it operates, a lot of discipline. We've been through hell and back. I think there's a lot that veterans could offer if equipped with the right ideology of the working class ideology and of Marxism in general. But we can't educate them if these veteran organizations are just telling them to shut up because of the way that you look.
Right.
I've almost left the entire peace and anti-war movement I have a foot in the door, and a lot of people know me. I've made my mark there. I could easily go back, but it's not worth it right now. They're just doing these protests, taking pictures, posting it on social media over and over, and they get funds from the ruling class to donate to their nonprofit organizations, their NGOs, and it's just this. It's an industry. It's an industry that only reproduces the petty bourgeoisie. It doesn't further the revolutionary movement here.
That's interesting. So they formed this NGO, and then so there are people with money will support them, and that really make diverse the tension. That's really interesting.
But there's the people, the petty bourgeois activists in these organizations are so clueless about a class analysis. They just need money to do the next big thing, the big event, big protest, big coalition in Washington, D.C. or whatever. And they don't think about, if the ruling class is giving you this money to change their policies and interests, that doesn't make any sense if you just think about it at that level.
But they get funding from what kind of place? I mean, you're saying
one organization I was in had funding for many years, every year, maybe like $50,000 from the guy who created Craigslist.
Oh, okay.
Billionaire, progressive,
right.
But he's still part of the ruling class. I would say even the monopoly ruling class. There was Veterans for Peace almost got a donation from USAID.
Whoa.
The Agency for International Development, which is part of the U.S. government that represents the U.S. bourgeoisie. And they almost took that, but they have taken a lot of donations from other people. They take donations from working class people as well, but the big ones, $100,000 here or there comes from the ruling class.
From certain wing of the ruling class, and they have different, they're bickering about how to do it, and they have, No, so that was the one mistake that you find. But why do you say it's Maoist? But that's almost common, not only Maoist, any kind of people who claim to be Marxists tend to make that same kind of mistake. It's not exclusive Maoist, right?
I think the difference between the peace and anti-war petty bourgeois activists and the revisionist Marxists, I would call them, is that the peace and anti-war movement doesn't wave the red flag. They're not trying to represent the working class. They think they have bourgeois humanism, basically. They say, we're all one people, we're all one family, right? When the revisionist Marxists are representing themselves as representatives of the working class, as representatives of who may know how to get to socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat here. And I think that is like the fundamental difference here, which is a lot of people don't know that there's so many different tendencies in Marxism. You just hear socialism, and that's good because that's not capitalism. And I hate capitalism, and it's a very surface level investigation. And then it can be even confusing for a lot of that. But the revisionist Marxists, again, I think this goes to the decades-long mistake of the overall communist movement of abandoning the workplace and being so confused about what it means to wage revolution here and making mistake after mistake after mistake. And still, for the majority of Marxists in this country, still not realizing, what's this fundamental contradiction in society between the working class and the capitalist class? And so in the U.S. we have dozens of Marxist and communist organizations that are completely filled with bourgeois thought, essentially. I mean, that is what revisionism is, to its core. And in some sense, I'm like, we just need to go back to the basics. And because it's, been such a long mistake of generations, this newer generation of Marxists who've been more politicized, say by Occupy Wall Street, the recession of 2008, or of Standing Rock, COVID-19, Bernie Sanders. Right. All this has politicized a lot of people in the past 5-10 years.
But how do you define? You're saying these are revisionists. So what do you mean by that?
So all of these new people get involved with Marxism, but when they look into like all of these socialist organizations, there's dozens and dozens of them.
Right.
And they all have slightly different ideas of what socialism actually means. There's no real scientific investigation about all this. But this is the main point I wanted to say. But since everyone is very new and young, and it's been such a long time of making mistakes in the communist movement in the U.S., we really don't have any elders who have lifelong experiences to kind of teach us what they learned from, what mistakes they made. We're almost starting from scratch. Our elders are the internet right now.
Right.
What did Lenin say here? Right. What did Mao say here?
Or in the U.S., whatever Foster said.
Whatever Foster said, yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is really a generation gap. I mean, well, you still have the CPUSA, you still have many of these 70s, the so-called communist organizations, but the newer generation find them not as appealing.
These older organizations, no. There are newer, there's CPUSA, RCP still exists. Right. There's 6 different Black Panther Party organizations. You name it. There's so many older ones. But there's newer ones like PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, that actually came from Workers' World Party, which is an older organization that still exists. And PSL has really been one of the organizations that has attracted a lot of newer people, taking advantage of the George Floyd protests in 2020 and taking people down the wrong road.
Well, so why do you say they're taking the wrong road? What is their approach?
So PSL came from Workers' World, and Workers' World really was an organization formed by someone named Sam Marcy. And Sam Marcy essentially is a Trotskyist. So these are Trotskyist organizations. They rejected, even Workers' World and PSL, they rejected the idea of the Sino-Soviet split and thought that Mao was wrong in criticizing the Soviet Union and calling them revisionists. And even to this day, PSL and Workers' World believe that China is socialist, that Cuba is socialist, that North Korea is socialist. They support people in Iran and Gaddafi in Libya when he was alive. Really a lot of backwards ideas here. And people want to have hope that some socialist country exists out there that is fighting against U.S. imperialism. And if there isn't, people lose hope, which means they don't have a class analysis. Where does this movement come from? It comes from within the ruling class, the working class here. The working class here is, as Mao said, it's the masses who make history. And it's the working class that we need to really put our confidence in because they are the one class that is going to lead us to liberation of all exploitation and oppression.
Well, I mean, that's like PSL, their opinion about other countries is one thing. How that manifests in the shop floor, in the struggle, in the union, or in the peace movement, or in concretely, what does that mean?
A part of Marxism, from Sam Marcy again, who influences Workers' World and PSL. And I would say a lot of the U.S. left today, they're one of the organizations who have kind of abandoned the workplace. Marcy writes specifically in his piece, The Global Class War. He writes about protesting, taking positions on issues and protesting them publicly. And he says, this is combat for the proletariat against the ruling class. So he's saying, make some signs, go out and protest and do some chants. This is the main way that we combat and have class struggle and class war against the ruling class. Nothing about the actual working class in their day-to-day lives, in their workplace, or the contradiction between labor and capital.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, you get it. Yeah, I see it.
He also divides the entire world up into two camps, an imperialist camp and a proletarian camp.
Oh, okay.
I think this is also in line with a form of Trotskyism.
Right.
Marxism is a very U.S.-specific form of Trotskyism.
Okay.
And so just that idea of alone, the entire world split into just two classes, is a very surface-level understanding of the particular contradictions that happen inside of every single country, or even in each city in that country. And it kind of negates those contradictions and says, like, well, you just have to choose a side. That's all you have to do. And so where is the actual struggle? How do you build up the movement? And they like to call themselves Marxist-Leninists from time to time. And Marcy also tries to fuse Leninism with Trotskyism.
Right. Well, a lot of Trotskyists do that. Yeah.
And if anybody knows about the actual ideas of Trotsky and Lenin, there are actually very opposite sides that are opposing each other.
And also Lenin had long polemic against Trotsky before October Revolution.
And Lenin's ideas have been proven to be way more correct than Trotsky's ideas. But for some reason, they keep pushing it along. I mean, there's all kinds of other problems with, say, Marxism. They believe like the central committee of a party is kind of like a holy grail, a sacred space that you can never really criticize. Like that is, they represent all of the interests of the working class. And if you criticize them, you're criticizing the working class. And how dare you do that?
Whoa, I didn't realize that.
If we are over here in the U.S. criticizing them, or the Korean Workers' Party and their leadership, wherever, they just don't do this. But this is what revisionists do, and this is what pseudoscientists do in any branch of sciences. They never really talk about any other ideas. They always try to prove to you their idea, and that's all they stick to. And they very much promote this within their organizations. There's just dozens and dozens of former members of Workers' World and PSL who have openly talked about how you cannot criticize leadership within PSL or Workers' World. But these ideas are some of the most popular ideas in the left right now. People who are interested in socialism, they go online, and the biggest names are people like PSL.